Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.
Public participation makes a huge difference. I mean, I can't even emphasize that enough. It does make a difference, and that's what I love about the Environmental Defense Center. You know, we're not just lawyers sitting at a desk. We're out in the community, and we really are educating and empowering the public. Once a community has a victory like that, it changes everything. After that, that same community has on its own stood up to fight against coastal power plants and other threats in the area, but now they know that they can make a difference.
That's today's guest on Sidebar, Linda Krop, Chief Counsel of the nonprofit Environmental Defense Center.
Sidebar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, and Empire College of Law, located in Santa Rosa.
Welcome to Sidebar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your co-hosts, Jackie Gardina and Mitch Winnick.
We are very pleased today to have Linda Krop, the Chief Counsel of the Environmental Defense Center, as our guest today on Sidebar, Optimism in Action. Linda has worked at the Environmental Defense Center as a staff attorney since 1989 and as chief counsel since 1999. Her specialties include fighting offshore oil and gas development, protecting natural resources, and preserving open space lands. Linda, we're very pleased to have you join us today on Sidebar because, as many people know, protection of offshore environmental areas has become another key element in the news today. Welcome to Sidebar.
Thank you for having me.
Linda, tell us a little about your journey into the Environmental Defense Center.
I came to Santa Barbara to go to the university here. While at the university, I got involved in some pretty significant environmental causes as a volunteer and continued that after I graduated. So after a couple years of being out of school, I realized I wanted to pursue a career path in environmental advocacy and started talking to folks, especially people who had been in the environmental studies program at UC Santa Barbara, and asked, their advice. And everyone kept referring me to a gentleman named Mark McGinnis, who was one of the founders of the environmental studies program and environmental law courses at UC Santa Barbara. It turns out he also founded the Environmental Defense Center, a public interest environmental law firm. And so he encouraged me to go the legal path. It had not been on my radar, but he suggested that I go to law school and hopefully would be able to end up as an attorney at the Environmental Defense Center. So the entire time I was in law school, I was a law clerk here and learned on the job and was immediately just passionate about the work that this organization does.
The area that your organization works is really close to my heart. I'm originally from Galveston County, Texas, so I remember the impact of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And my understanding is an oil spill was one of the impetus for the creation of the Environmental Defense Center back in 1977.
Yes, that's true. In 1969, the largest oil spill in United States history at that time occurred off of Santa Barbara from one of the platforms that was installed just a couple years prior. What a lot of people don't realize is offshore oil development in the United States actually started in Santa Barbara County. A lot of people think it was probably the Gulf of Mexico, but it was actually off of Santa Barbara County in the late 1800s. A few decades later, some of the first offshore platforms were installed. And then in 1969, there was a major blowout from Platform A. And that oil spill just devastated the coast, and our economy, our fisheries, our tourism, the environment. And it led to the first Earth Day in 1970. It led to the introduction of our modern environmental laws that we still rely on today. The National Environmental Policy Act came directly out of the oil spill because had the federal government thought about what it was permitting on that platform, it would have understood the risks of an oil spill and may not have approved the oil company's request. So that immediately led to the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970, and then after that, the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act.
And these laws that provided environmental protection, like you're explaining, were not particularly political, were they?
What's important to realize is all of those laws passed with tremendous bipartisan support, and they were signed by President Nixon. The only law that he did not sign was the Clean Water Act, and there was so much bipartisan support that Congress overrode his veto. But it was the 1969 oil spill that really just transformed the way our country looks at how we as humans impact the environment and how that affects us as well.
And I know that we've focused initially on oil spills, but one of the things that really impressed me is that the Environmental Defense Center has a much broader mandate than that. Looking at your website, 115 nonprofit groups have been represented by your organization. You've protected 100,000 acres of open space, and you organize over 2,000 hours a year of volunteer hours. Talk to us about some of the other non-oil spill things that your organization is doing.
Our organization is very unique. We are a hybrid of a public interest law firm and a nonprofit organization. So that gives us tremendous flexibility to adapt to whatever the threats and opportunities are in our area. And so to back up a minute, I should point out where we operate. We're on the central coast of California. Our mission is to help other organizations and to assist the community in achieving its environmental protection goals. So we've represented, as you said, over 100 organizations, including groups like Audubon, Sierra Club, Surfrider Foundation, a lot of local groups. Our main program areas are we continue to work on oil issues. Right now, we're fighting the Trump administration that wants to open up the California coast to more oil drilling. So we do a lot of work on oil issues, and we support the transition to clean, renewable energy. So we do a lot of work to try to combat climate change.
And in addition to the oil and gas issues, particularly offshore, what other areas are you working on?
We also have an expansive portfolio trying to preserve important open spaces like wildlife habitats and species that are important to the ecosystem here. We have a whole marine program. We recently helped establish a brand new national marine sanctuary, the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary off the California coast, one of the largest sanctuaries in the nation's history, and the first tribally nominated sanctuary. So that's very exciting. And then we do a lot of work on environmental justice, trying to combat pollution sources that have a disparate impact on disadvantaged communities.
One of the things you mentioned there was your current work with the efforts by the Trump administration to open back up and expand offshore oil drilling and offshore oil development. My worry is that as a coastal resident, having lived, as I said, on the Gulf Coast and now on the Pacific Coast, that discussion to those in America who don't live on a coast, they listen to that and they go, so what's the big deal? Drilling for oil, we need it, it improves the economy. They listen to that side of the argument. I don't think they focus on the cost of that from an environmental or damaging our long-term environmental safety and health. Talk a little about that, because I think that's part of the conversation that we really need to focus on.
Unfortunately, we know all too well the risks and harm associated with offshore oil and gas development. In addition to the massive blowout in 1969, we've had other oil spills since then, and most notably in 2015, about 10 years ago, we had another massive oil spill related to offshore production here. The oil actually spilled from an onshore pipeline that was carrying oil from one of the platforms, and it spilled into the beach at a state park, caused evacuation of the state park, and it spread 150 miles down the California coast, so closing beaches, killing hundreds of seabirds and dolphins and other marine wildlife, shutting down our tourism and fishing industry for a couple months. And we're still aware of the impacts of that spill to this day. So unfortunately, with oil development, it's not a question of if a spill will occur, it's a question of when it will occur. And right now, one of our biggest cases is trying to prevent the restart of that same oil pipeline.
One of the things I worry about is that there's a concern that we need to work together with corporations and the oil corporations to be able to balance what they want to do on our behalf of providing fossil fuel and the environment, which doesn't have a spokesperson unless groups like yours step up. How would you frame that argument for those who are listening?
Well, we've been dealing with the oil industry here off of California for more than 100 years, and we've seen the direct impacts from things like air pollution and oil spills, but we also are very affected by climate change, being a coastal state. And so between sea level rise and increase in our wildfires, we used to have a wildfire season, now it's year round. We have flooding. We're seeing the long-term impacts of fossil fuel development. We've been working really hard to try to help the state of California transition to cleaner, renewable sources of energy. So, for example, we've been supporting solar projects, both at a distributed scale, but also we have commercial scale solar projects here now. We are supporting offshore wind. There's a proposal for some pretty major offshore wind development in California. We've been working with both the agencies within the government as well as with the developers. So that's been a very important aspect of our work. So again, trying to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and promote the next generation of clean energy.
Support for Optimism in Action comes from the Monterey College of Law, a nonprofit law school serving the Monterey Bay region with evening classes on campus or in a hybrid online format. More details and applications available at montereylaw.edu. That's montereylaw.edu.
One of the things I had the opportunity to do when I was visiting Alaska a year or so ago, we went to one of the whale museums. And one of the things they had an entire exhibit about was the impact that commercial shipping has on marine life, whales, seals, sea lions, and how the noise disrupts them. There's a noise pollution underwater. Once I looked at that exhibit, I thought, okay, that makes sense, but I have to admit, it never dawned on me that that could be an issue. Not just when a ship strikes one of these animals, but the pollution that disrupts their entire environment. I noticed that in 2025, one of your top 10 accomplishments dealt with the Blue Whale, Blue Skies statewide operation. Tell us a little about that.
Whales are a huge part of our environment, our identity here. The Santa Barbara Channel is considered the Galapagos of North America. That was what President FDR named it, because we have the Channel Islands and a very deep channel with upwelling that provides amazing habitat for migrating whales. One of the most unique spots on the planet for whales. In fact, we have the largest population of blue whales seasonally every summer here. So it's very important habitat for whales. At the same time, we're right in the middle of the shipping lanes coming from Northern California, coming from Asia into the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And so we have a conflict here. Definitely noise is very impactful to whales. But in 2007, we also had 5 blue whales that were killed as a result of ship strikes. That was unprecedented. And so ever since then, we've been working to try to prevent that risk. And what we came up with was 2 strategies. One is, within the limitations geographically, try to avoid conflicts and confrontations between whales and ships. And so we were able to work with the Coast Guard and the International Maritime Organization to try to move the shipping lanes away from the main whale migration and feeding areas, and to even expand areas where ships are not allowed. So that was the first step, but there's still going to be some overlap. And so the other thing we learned from the scientists was if ships slow down, there is less chance of a fatal ship strike. And we learned that reduces the noise. which is helpful. And it has an amazing reduction in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's what the Blue Whales, Blue Skies program is focused on, is getting ships to slow down. We got funding from the air districts because of the huge public health benefit to help provide financial incentives to get ships to slow down. In fact, now it's such a popular program that something like 80% of the ships in the channel do slow down, and they get recognized. They can use that for marketing and advertising, but it's been a very successful program.
Was it only about the money, or was it the partnership with a public benefit that also was an incentive for the companies?
We were working with the air districts, which were actually putting money into the program because it has such a huge public health benefit. And that was the original incentive, was the shipping companies would get financial incentives, but now they actually prefer public recognition. So there is actually a certificate program where they receive awards for their participation in the Blue Whales, Blue Skies program, and the participation has increased to 80% of the ships going through this area. And now we've expanded this program statewide. That's what we celebrated last year.
It's such a great story because what you're talking about is not just conflict where you're attacking them and their lawsuits or their claims and counterclaims, but it really was a cooperative effort in which there's recognition for those who are doing well, and it makes them feel better about their contribution and what they're doing. And it sounds like that's as close to a win-win as you're ever going to have between environmentalists and shipping companies.
It's a fantastic program and hopefully a great model. It doesn't happen overnight. We started this work in 2007 and finally got a statewide program in 2025, but it was incrementally growing. And we did use our leverage as a law firm. We did submit a petition to the federal government to actually regulate ship speed, and that brought the industry to the table to talk. But over the years, it's been a very collaborative effort, and I hope it does serve as a model for other types of issues in other areas.
You had another project you recognized in 2025 that's also very near and dear to my heart, being in Carmel. We're on one side of Big Sur, and the work you're doing in Santa Barbara and Ventura is on the other side of Big Sur. But your Los Padres National Forest project impacted the logging interests in that. Tell us a little about forests. We've talked about oil and gas offshore. We've talked about the whales, but now we're talking about the trees.
A lot of people think national forests are protected similar to national parks, and that's just simply not true. Many types of uses, including commercial uses, are allowed in national forests. And in our backyard is the Los Padres National Forest, which is an amazing ecosystem running from the mountains all the way in some areas down to the sea, and home to the California condor and other endangered species, as well as really important Native American sites and sacred places. Unfortunately, it seems like no matter what presidential administration we're dealing with, there's an effort to open up our forests to commercial logging and clearing. And it's usually presented as something to reduce fire risk to urban communities. But the fact of the matter is these projects are way up in the mountains. They're not near any urban communities. And they're basically commercial logging projects. And so we've been involved in litigation. We are gearing up now to fight a massive project that would encompass hundreds of thousands of acres up along the ridgeline of Los Padres National Forest, many habitats, and affecting just a tremendous amount of wildlife. The Trump administration originally called this the Ecological Restoration Project. It's a thinning project. It's going to help the environment. And then there was such backlash that they changed it to the Wildfire Risk Reduction Project, but that's also not very accurate. So yes, we're engaged in that issue, and our client is Los Padres Forest Watch. They're a watchdog organization for this forest and a great partner in this effort.
Well, you would think that we'd covered just about everything that has a sticker that says environmental health, environmental future, but I thought we were at a point where we would not be talking about nuclear power plants and the danger of nuclear power as they started to decommission nuclear power plants around the world, but certainly across the United States. And then lo and behold, Diablo Canyon down in San Luis Obispo, at the cusp of being decommissioned and closed, got reinvigorated and is now supposedly going to look for 20 more years of operation. And you guys got involved in some concerns about that as well.
The Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant was supposed to decommission. There's 2 reactors. One was supposed to shut down in 2024 and one in 2025. And this came about as a result of an agreement with environmental groups in about 2017. So they had plenty of time to plan where other energy sources would come from. And part of the agreement was also to provide retraining for their workers. This is a utility company known as Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E. But as it got closer to the shutdown date, they didn't want to shut down, and our governor was worried about energy supplies and avoiding brownouts in California, and convinced our state legislature to pass a bill giving Diablo Canyon 5 more years. That law exempted Diablo Canyon from certain state requirements. However, the project still needed to be approved by the California Coastal Commission. And so we represented a local group opposing the extension as it was presented to the California Coastal Commission. And by the time the hearing happened late last year, we had evidence from the state's own energy agencies that energy from Diablo Canyon is not necessary for the state to meet its goals anymore. And the reason is that the state has made such advances in solar energy, battery storage, and transmission efficiencies. The state's own data shows that we don't need this nuclear power plant anymore. However, there was still a lot of political pressure to keep the plant open. And so the Coastal Commission did approve the 5-year extension, but more alarming, PG&E had to apply to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a license renewal, and they applied for a 20-year renewal, so going way beyond what the state legislature has authorized. The Coastal Commission, through a federal law called the Coastal Zone Management Act, gets to weigh in on that, and they approved that as well. That was quite a surprise. We would not have been surprised if they approved a 5-year extension, given what the state legislature had already done. But when they approved the 20-year extension, everyone was very shocked, and we will still do everything in our power through other avenues to prevent that from happening.
I want to shift back to what we focus on, which is optimism in action. And certainly your successes, your organization's successes over these years, many years now, gives us reason for optimism on some environmental victories, which are hard fought and, as you yourself said, sometimes take decades before you see results. But I want to focus on something else, which is the 2,000 plus volunteer hours. How do people get involved, and what do they do to help your organization?
Well, this goes to the nonprofit side of the Environmental Defense Center, which I love because it creates a relationship with the community that other law firms don't usually have. So volunteers help in a number of ways. They help, on the ground with things like creek cleanups. They help at our events. They help advocate. We do a lot of community education and engagement around our issues. About half of our cases are in court, but about half are pending before agencies, including local agencies like cities and counties, or state agencies like the California Coastal Commission. So we do a lot of education to the community about the issues that we're working on and what opportunities that they have to participate, because public participation makes a huge difference. I mean, I can't even emphasize that enough. I remember when we were fighting a massive liquefied natural gas project off of Oxnard about 10, 15 years ago, and we were fighting BHP Billiton, the largest mining company in the world, and they wanted to import natural gas to the West Coast, and they picked a location offshore Oxnard, which is a low-income, largely Hispanic community, thinking, they couldn't fight it. Well, luckily, not only were we hired, but the community was very involved, and we spent a lot of time in the community making sure people understood how to raise their voices and where the opportunities were. And we ended up having a hearing in Oxnard, and about 2,500 people showed up.
That certainly is impressive.
I think that swayed the vote. It does make a difference, and that's what I love about the Environmental Defense Center. We're not just lawyers sitting at a desk. We're out in the community, and we really are educating and empowering the public. Once a community has a victory like that, it changes everything. After that, that same community has on its own stood up to fight against coastal power plants and other threats in the area, but now they know that they can make a difference.
Knowing that many of these fights, as you said, take years, sometimes decades, and I know you've been devoted to this for many, many years. This has been your career focus. We can tell the passion you have for it in your description of what you're doing. What Jackie and I like to ask each of our guests is, when you get up in the morning and there's all of these huge mountains to overcome that you know are going to take patience and persistence, what keeps you coming to work, fired up?
Well, first of all, I'm blessed to have a job where I get to do every day what I would otherwise do as a volunteer. I believe so much in our work. This is so important to me. I also love the team I work with. We have a fantastic team here at the Environmental Defense Center. The fact that we do make a difference, the fact that the work we're doing is so important. If we weren't here, most of the time, no one else would be able to do this kind of work. So I think the fact that we are so important to the environment, to the community, that we are successful, it's a real David versus Goliath story. And yet, most of the time, we are able to prevail. And a lot of that is because of the laws that came out of the 1969 oil spill here. So it kind of comes back full circle. But we've made such a huge difference. We often talk about with our work, it's what you don't see that signifies our accomplishments. You don't see more oil platforms. You don't see the coast completely developed. In fact, one of our cases sounds like will be close to your heart is we went up against the Hearst Corporation, and they wanted to build massive development at the gateway to the Big Sur coast in Cambria and San Simeon, 4 major resorts, 3 golf courses, commercial, retail, equestrian center, would have just plopped LA on the Big Sur coast, and we were able to fight that, and now that area is permanently preserved. So a lot of what we've done is conservation oriented that you don't necessarily see, but it's important that people understand the effort that it took to preserve those places.
Well, Linda, thank you personally, because as you said, you are working in my backyard on things that are near and dear to me. We're pleased to see your successes. I'm impressed with the dedication of your organization. I see that you only have about a dozen full-time staff doing all of these things, along with some of your volunteers. It's just an extraordinary effort that is so important for those of us who understand what it takes to protect our coast and our oceans and our whales and on and on. Thank you so much for doing that, and thank you for joining us on Sidebar today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
What most impressed me today with this episode of Sidebar Optimism in Action was that Linda Krop and the Environmental Defense Center have such a breadth of areas in which they're working on behalf of the environment, marine mammals. They're negotiating issues related to shipping and oil and gas pipelines and oil and gas offshore rigs. It's just an amazing range of issues that they've tackled. And what's optimistic about this is that they've had such success, not just by using the courtroom to win these battles, but in many cases to motivate the communities that are impacted, getting them involved, working on education to expand our understanding of the issues, and then in many cases negotiating directly with the corporations that are involved on the industry side to come up with win-win opportunities. This is truly an example of how a combination of the law, public policy, and community activism can work together to the benefit of all.
Once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today on Sidebar. And as always, Mitch and I would love to know what's on your mind. You can reach us at sidebarmedia.org.
Sidebar would not be possible without our producer David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on Sidebar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates Sidebar's social media marketing.
Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.